Hey, and welcome into the next lesson. Before we move on to the theory of the subject, let me ask you right away to think about the current position. Not even about this one, but on the following move. Here it was black to play. It's the game between two amateur players. Here he took the pawn, queen takes b2, taking the knight, white played queen c1. How would you play here as black? What do you think? What is your impulse? Obviously, the black's queen is attacked, and therefore black needs to do something about that. A lot of players would grab the white's queen, would trade the queens, and simply play queen takes c1. Black is a pawn up. Overall, going to an endgame looks like a good idea, and black does not waste time retreating with the queen. Am I right? Actually, no. Why is that so? Because there is a rule which says to take is a mistake. If you've been following me for quite some time, then you probably are familiar with this rule. If not, let me explain. But in either case, it will still be useful for you to keep training this rule, because one thing is to know about something, about any kind of tactical motif or strategic idea, and doing it repeatedly in your own games is actually not that easy. It's not as easy as just knowing it. You gotta keep practicing it. Anyway, let me explain the reason behind it. What do I mean by saying to take is a mistake? Let's see what happens after black captures the white's queen. As you can see, by doing that exchange, by trading the queens, black actually helps white to bring the rook into play. Previously it did nothing on a1. On c1 it's still not very active, but at least it protects the knight potentially, and anyway, it's more active than it was earlier. Therefore, by trading the queens, black does not achieve anything, but only helps white to activate his rook. Even more so, if you would compare the activity of these two pieces, the two queens, you would notice that definitely the black's queen on b2 is more active than the white's counterpart. Which means that exchanging these two pieces is in favor of white. We talked about it earlier that the fundamental idea of the chess game is the idea of activity. You gotta try to keep your position more active than the opponent's pieces. And that is also the thing that you need to consider while thinking about an opportunity of an exchange. Alright, let's think about another thing. If you don't want to take there, then what would you do? Going back is also not a very promising thing, because men naturally want to attack. But in this position there is the way to do that. It's to move bishop to a3. If you found it yourself, great. If not, no worries, we'll keep training. What's the point of this move? Black is not only protecting the queen, but is also actually threatening white to capture. Now notice the difference. Now in case white takes, which is like obviously a bad option, now this time it helps black to activate his bishop and to double attack the white's pieces. In the actual game, white did something else. Instead, he played pawn to e4 to provide an additional support for the queen with his dark squared bishop from g5, but black continued with queen to b4 with the discovered attack of the queen, preparing bishop b2 on the next move, which he did play, and black is winning. Actually, in the game, white played rook b1, but anyway, black can take here the material, and as you can see, and at the very end of this line, let's say white takes, black recaptures, and black has a whole extra rook, and therefore black is definitely winning. Going back to the starting position of this example, you may notice that just by not trading the queens, but keeping up the pressure, black managed to win the game almost right away within just a few moves. While if black would take on c1, well, he's just a pawn up, but that would be a long game after that, and the result is unclear. That's the power of this idea. And this is a counterintuitive idea. Most people fail, actually, at this stuff. But if you know the rule to take is a mistake, you will always try to find an opportunity to do it better. Now, there's one distinction I gotta make here. By saying to take it is a mistake, I imply the positions of an exchange of equal pieces, just like in this case, an exchange of two queens. But if we would take a step back and look at this position where black could just grab the pawn for nothing, then definitely you should take. In that case, it's not an exchange, you're winning the material. And if you can win the material with no danger, certainly you should do this. And in such positions, you definitely need to take. But when it's the position where you are considering an opportunity of an exchange, then you need to apply the rule to take as a mistake. Here is another example, the game between Carlsen and Nakamura. It was black to play here, and black played pawn to d5. What would you play here? I hope that after knowing the rule, you know that you should refrain from making this automatic reaction and taking the pawn on d5. And most of the people would just do that. Whenever they see an opportunity to take, they would just do this, because it's in our human nature to simplify the things. We dislike when there is some complexity, when there is a tension, there are many opportunities, we're not sure which one to pick, we want to simplify things. But in chess, you'd better keep up the pressure, and just remind yourself that keeping the pressure is just as unpleasant for you as it is for your opponent. So this could be an idea which may just help you feel better about this. Anyway, let's just analyze for the sake of clarity, what would happen if white just goes ahead and takes there on d5? We can see that it helps black to, first of all, bring the knight into play with the tempo. Now he's attacking the white's bishop on e3, the white's knight on c3. If white keeps taking there, then it would also help black to activate his queen. And as a result of this exchange, you can see that there are a number of changes in the position. Black activated his queen. He opened up the diagonal for his bishop. White has the weak pawn on d3, which black will easily attack with the support of his heavy pieces like rook to d8, and he will easily increase the pressure over that pawn on d3. It is actually a disastrous position for white. It's probably losing, and it happened just because white gave up the pressure and took on d5. Let's see what are the other alternatives. Let me go back to the starting position. What else can white possibly play here? Potentially white could have pushed the pawn forward. This is the move that is definitely worth considering, but in the current position it does not really work because black does not have to retreat. Instead he can counterattack by pushing the pawn to d4. And then, if white captures the knight, black recaptures, and thanks to this double attack, black will take back one of the pieces on the next move, and at the same time his position is again becomes just really active. It's probably not what white wants as well. So let's go back. Finally, what should white do? Well, if you just think about the black's advancement d5 and ask yourself, is there any threat here? You would notice that black is actually not threatening to take one of your pawns because these pawns are already protected. The only real threat that black has is to push the pawn forward to d4 with a double attack of your minor pieces. And therefore, that's the only thing that you need to address. Carlsen addressed it by simply playing bishop to f2, removing his bishop from this potential double attack, but more importantly, he keeps the pressure. Later on, he won the game. It was a long game. It's irrelevant to our subject. That's why I will not show you the entire game. But just notice how Carlsen keeps the pressure and refrains from this impulsive decision to take on d5. Here's one more example. This time, it's the game between Quezada and Caruana. Here's the question for you. Question of the day today is, should black take on d4? I hope that by now your first answer is no. Having said that, it does not mean that you should never take anything. Of course, you should consider these possibilities because at times it can give you some specific advantage. If that's the case, you should definitely go for that option. But if there is no particular reason, then just trading the pawns for nothing would be a mistake. If black would just trade off the pawns, for example, like this, that would already be sort of a concession for black, sort of a mistake, because let's look back at this position and notice the difference. Black is trading his pawn c5 for the white's pawn c3. The black's pawn is more advanced compared to the white's pawn, and therefore it is more active. Usually more advanced pieces are more active. Therefore, this kind of a trade is in favor of white. It gives white a little bit better situation in terms of activity. That's why just trading the pawns would be bad for black. If black would even continue this style and would even take here with a pawn, that would even help white to activate his knight, to put it in the center with the tempo. Therefore, that would be just one more mistake for black. Going backward, taking is not a good option, but in this particular position, Caruana noticed an interesting tactical trick. He actually took there on d4 with the e-pawn, and after that, he continued with pawn to c4. He took there not for the sake of an exchange, but because he noticed that after the white's bishop retreats, he can make an interesting tactical theme, and he played pawn to c3. That was the point of trading the pawns on d4. Now, it's not really a sacrifice because white can't take the pawn. In this case, black would simply push the pawn to b2, winning the white's bishop. That's not a good option for white. And if we come back to that position, you may notice that since white cannot really capture that pawn on the next move, black would be able to push it even further on the c2, which will create for black this protected passed pawn, already one square away from the square of promotion, and therefore it will definitely be something very annoying for white. It will also take away a lot of squares in the white's position, etc., and it just gives black the positional advantage. Black can push the pawn there right away to c2, or even wait for a few more moves, if in case white cannot stop it anyway. Black can even keep the pressure there. All in all, what I wanted to illustrate by this example is that I'm not going to say that you should never even consider the opportunity to take. Sometimes there is a specific tactical benefit that you can gain out of this exchange, and in that case you still may and even should exchange pawns or pieces. In this case, that was the reason, and that's why Carlsen went for it. Just the ultimate conclusion here is that you need to calculate the lines a little bit. If you see that as a result of the exchange you can get a certain specific advantage, you should go for that. If you can win material, or if you can get a certain specific positional advantage, that's alright. You can and should trade pieces or pawns. But if it's just an exchange with no specific consequences, then you should refrain from it. And in this game, it was quite a spectacular way that Caruana took advantage of this interesting tactical trick. We'll not analyze the game until the end, but as always, you can find all the games that I'm showing you in the supplementary materials. In case you wish to see the entire game, you can do it there. Here is the last game of this lesson. This is a game between the players Voss and Boring. Not very famous players. They are 2100 rated players. It is black to play right now, and what do you think about this position? How would you play here as black? I'm just giving you a few seconds to think about it yourself, so that later on you can compare your ideas with the moves played in the game, because in that case you will actually train your skill, not just observe it passively, but you will train your skills, and therefore you will be able to use them right after watching this course. Okay, obviously you can see this tension between the two pawns, and this is something that black has to address, or otherwise white will simply grab the pawn for nothing. A lot of players would automatically take the pawn on f3, but in that case, as we already know, to take is a mistake. In case black takes the pawn there, that would only help white to bring the rook further, and we'll have a look at this line in a moment, but let's first see what was the correct continuation for black. The correct continuation definitely is to keep up the pressure. Therefore, black needs to provide an additional support for that e4 pawn, which he did by playing bishop to f5. Now, what would happen in case white takes there on e4? Similar thing. Whenever somebody releases the tension, it usually helps an opponent to move his pieces forward. In this particular case, black may take this pawn right away with the bishop, but in that case, white would be able to trade his knight for the bishop, which is generally a good thing for white. Therefore, it's possible option for black. There is nothing like terribly wrong there, but it still gives white a little bit of a positional advantage because of knight over bishop exchange. Instead, black could do even a better thing. He could possibly play bishop to g6, saving this bishop because there is no way for white to save this pawn anyway, and black is going to capture it on the next move with the knight. For example, if white plays queen d1 to just remove the queen from danger, black captures on e4, and then recaptures with the queen, and then notice that because white released the pressure, took on e4, it actually helped black to bring the queen forward to an active square. You may notice that it's a pretty interesting thing. Whoever releases the tension usually appears to be at a disadvantage, and that's a really common theme. Alright, now let's see another interesting thing. So this is the correct way for black, but let's also see what would happen in case black would go into the incorrect way. Let's go back to the starting position of this example. We discussed that bishop f5 is the way to go for black to keep up the pressure, but what if he releases the pressure? There is actually a really interesting line that could have happened here. I'm not sure, of course, if these players calculated all these lines, but it's just a really spectacular continuation. That's why I just want to share with you. Here white could took it with the rook, just like we discussed earlier. The fact that black took allows white to move forward. Now, there is an interesting tactical thing that you may notice. Because white has the queen onto c2 and the knight on g5, which are both aiming at the h7 square, white is actually threatening to grab that knight first on f6 and then to deliver a straightforward checkmate with queen takes h7. What can black do about this? Well, it looks like he should just push the knight away by playing h6. In this case, white still may grab the knight on f6. He's threatening queen h7 checkmate. Therefore, black really cannot take the rook. It would result to queen h7 checkmate. The only thing that black can do is to take back the knight. Currently, the material is equal, and white could have, of course, just moved his rook backward, which would lead to a normal position. But as I promised, there is a really amazing continuation and a shocking one. White here has the straightforward win by playing rook to h6. Very unexpected move and quite an unusual combination, I would say. White insistently wants to play queen h7, but it looks like white is just playing the give-up chess. He's giving away the rook for nothing. But there is a reason behind it. After black captures the rook, white has queen g6 check, taking advantage of the pin with the light-scored bishop. The king has to go king h8, captures the pawn, king has to go back. Now white can, of course, play queen g6, and that will lead to a perpetual check, but there is a stronger way for white. White can just bring up more reserves. And I think that it's also quite an interesting thing here that after sacrificing an entire rook, white can continue his attack with such a simple move as rook to f1, just simply bringing more piece into the attack. And the idea is white is threatening to go rook f6, and there is really nothing black can do about it. For example, let's say he plays bishop e6 or almost any other move, white would still play rook to f6. And in the previous variations, white used advantage of the pin, and he played queen g6, but now he's threatening to take the pawn on g5. For example, something like bishop b3, white could take that pawn and then deliver a checkmate like this. Quite a spectacular line. It did not happen in the actual game. I just found it while analyzing this game for you, and I wanted to share it with you just because of such an unusual type of combination that white used here. Anyway, as the ultimate conclusion from the entire lesson, I hope that you got the point. It's pretty straightforward. To take is a mistake, and usually you gotta refrain from the first impulse to take whenever there is an opportunity to exchange things, and instead take a little bit of time to think, and if you can find a way to maintain the pressure, to keep it up, it is usually a better way to go. But if you can take and win something, if you can just win the material or something else, then you should go ahead and take it and grab the advantage whatever you can. This is the ultimate conclusion from this subject. A lot of people make tons of mistakes here. They always take, they never refrain themselves from doing that. But I hope that after this lesson you know that to take is a mistake and you will follow it in your games.